Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Patricia Edwards, a member of the Reading Hall of Fame and a professor of language and literacy in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. I served as a member of the ILA Board of Directors from 1998 to 2001 and later as president 2010-11. I am excited to introduce you to tonight's presenter, Dr. Towanda Harris. Dr. Harris is the author of The Right Tools, a guide to selecting, evaluating, and implementing classroom resources and practices. Currently, an instructional leadership coordinator and an adjunct professor of reading and writing at Clark Atlanta University. She brings years of experience to the education world, ranging from classroom teacher, staff developer, literacy content specialist, and instructional coach. As a member of the hashtag G2 Great Twitter chat team of educators, she enjoys engaging in meaningful dialogue that challenges education and centers students in the process. Her passion to elevate teachers' voices through her podcast, My Two Cents, provides a space for a community of educators to share their personal stories. In tonight's ILA webinar, Dr. Harris will establish a rationale for determining and evaluating quality resources and practices for learners' varied concerns. Participants will learn how to determine students' strengths and needs to make equitable instructional decisions that place students at the center of the learning. Ways to establish a path of checkpoints that help students reach their personal goals will be discussed, and strategies and tools that will help to ensure that daily instruction is being driven by the learner and not the resource will be shared. There will be a time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions for Dr. Harris, please feel free to submit them at any time by using the Zoom Q&A feature or by posting in the comments on the Facebook live stream video. If you are tweeting alone, please remember to tag ILA using ILA Today and the hashtag ILA Webinar. If you would like to rewatch or share this event with a colleague, a closed caption recording will be available within 10 days on Zoom and on Facebook. And without further ado, please welcome Dr. Towanda Harris.
Well, first, I want to say thank you so much, Ms. Patricia, for just that awesome introduction. And thank you, ILA, for this opportunity to be with such awesome educators from around the world. And also thank you, Heinemann, for sponsoring this event. We have a lot to cover. I'm so excited. I've been thinking about just this moment all day today, just about all of the great discussions that we're going to have. So without further ado, I am going to get started. And I have two screens. So I'm looking, if I look to the side, I'm looking at all of the activity that's going on in the chat, and it's really exciting to see everyone from around the world just kind of saying hi. And so just keep those conversations going. I'm going to throw a lot of questions throughout our time together so that we can learn from each other in this environment. So today we're going to talk about a journey to a student-centered classroom, equitable practices that really make a difference. If you are not following me, my Twitter handle is at the bottom, but hashtag the right tools as well as tag ILA Today and Heinemann so that I could hear the discussion and be a part of the discussion as well. So I always like to start off with a little bit about me. These are three of my favorite pictures, and they all tell a story of who I am as an educator. You know, it's like that other side of who you are. The first picture is a picture of my father and my mother. My father has an 8th grade education, and my mother has a high school diploma. And one of the things that they really made sure was key and priority is that education was very important to them. And regardless of where they were in their education, they made sure that there was always a village around us. I am the youngest of 8. My children are the youngest of 22 grandchildren. And I won't even begin to talk about the great grandchildren. And so when we're talking about such a very large family, and to be able to say that they put education first, and regardless of an 8th grade education, regardless of a high school diploma, they knew that there were certain limitations, and they were very mindful to bring people around us so that we can be great. And that's what we do for our children, right? If we can't answer a question, we try to build an environment that our students can do that very thing, or other teachers in the building, someone to wrap around, the counselor, the social emotional learner coordinator, or just anyone that we know that will help to better meet the needs of our students. The next picture is a picture of my family. This is a crazy picture. This is a very old picture, actually. And in this picture, it's so funny because it's an old picture of my 3 children. My oldest is now in college, but this picture really captures for me all of my children's personalities. I have 3, my husband and I, we have 3 children, and each one of them just bring a different thing to the table. And I want to just highlight that 2 of my students, 2 students, I feel like I'm their teacher as well, but 2 of my children, they have ADHD. All 3 of them are gifted. Now, why do I bring that up? I bring that up because I have had to advocate and unlearn and relearn some things, as well as to help other educators to know that regardless of students' learning styles, that has nothing to do with their brilliance. They bring so much to the table. And so as a teacher, as a parent, I know that our students have so much value, and we want to, as educators, build upon what they already have. And the last picture is a picture of my dog. His name is Charger, not because he charges anyone. It's because he is named after the San Diego Chargers. My brother, may he rest in peace, he had Lou Gehrig's disease, and he played for the San Diego Chargers. And so in honor of him, what we did was we named our dog after Charger. Now, I know, don't hate me now, I was scared of dogs. Oh my goodness, can you believe it? I had a really large fear of dogs. And so one of the things that I had to do was try to learn the behaviors of a dog so that I did not run away from a dog while I was with my children, because you all would talk about me on the streets, right? If woman leaves children running away from a dog, and we don't want, that to happen. So what I had to do was get outside of my comfort zone. And getting outside of my comfort zone, we have to do that all of the time as educators. We have to really make sure that what we deem as comfortable, if it's not working for our students, that we are okay with stepping outside of that comfort and making sure that we are constantly in a learning type of mode so that we can be the best that we can for our children. So for today's time together that we have, we're going to think about 3 areas that we can be more equitable in our approach to connecting with students. The first thing that we're going to do is, first and foremost, we're going to start with our students. After we talk about, the students making connections with our students, then we are going to look at the resource. How do we make those connections within a resource to our students? And lastly, thinking about the structures that we have in place. What structures do we have in place that allow for student voice to be there, that allow for student agency to take place? And we want to make sure that we are constantly reflecting on ways that we can invite or create safe spaces for our students' voices to be heard, so that they are a part of the learning and it's not a one-way type of transaction. So let's start where I wanted to start with this article and just think about where we are in our world. We are still in a pandemic. And so we know as educators that this has affected us greatly. It has affected us greatly. And so CNN just recently published an article, and the link will be dropped into the chat. And in the article, I pulled out a quote that was quite alarming. Of course, the headline is going to just jump out at us. Staggering numbers of children have lost at least one parent to COVID-19, model estimates. So I'm going to pause here, and I want to give you a little bit of time for you to read these numbers. So pretty big, right? 37,300 to 43,000 already affected. And so we know that this is affecting children as a whole, but this is even more alarming. Black children are disproportionately affected, comprising only 14% of children in the US, but 20% of those losing a parent to COVID. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us when we are thinking about all of the things, all of the factors that children have to consider when they're even coming in a space to learn? We first have to acknowledge that we are all experiencing this pandemic together. And we have realized that every moment is not promised to us, and that we have to really try to reprioritize what's really important. So how do we do that with our students? How do we make sure that there's not a disconnect from what we're teaching to who they are as a human being? I like to start off with this great quote from Ariel Johnson, and the link to her blog, Kinderbender, will be in the chat. Here is a quote, and I'm going to pause for you to read this, and I want you to just type in some words that are really jumping out to you in this quote. Willful ignorance, visible, fail to see. Yes, acknowledgement, definitely. Exacerbate, abate. Yes, yes, yes. All of these things really make us just think about, our own practices, and thinking about our children and what they are experiencing or what they have experienced, let alone ourselves, while they're going through this pandemic and being in our classroom. But we understand that this is not a pandemic schooling problem, but it is now exacerbated to the point that not acknowledging it is willful ignorance. So we'll talk a little bit about today how that happens. How do we make these connections? How are we intentional with making the effort to connect the learning to our students? So I'm going to start with Sarah Ahmed's work around name stories. This is from her the book. She talks about this in her book, Being the Change. And a little bit about name stories is that they are individual explanations of personal or traditional meaning, importance, or origin of their names. Writing stories helps folks see the power in their names. It kind of helps you puff your chest up a little bit. And also listening to others' names, stories, unpacks their personal history of who they are. And so we think about pronouncing a student's name correctly or spelling a student's name correctly. That's really important. And so learning their name story, you get to see that power. So when we come to the curriculum and we begin teaching, we're able to automatically bring in those connections. So we're going to start with a short video, and this is by Idris Goodwin, and this is a short video on Say My Name. And as you're listening to this, I also want you to think about a special memory about your name. Don't put it in the chat just yet, but I want you to think about that, and you can drop it in the chat when we're done.
Hello. I'm well. How you doing? Could I have a black coffee, please, to go?
Yeah, sure. What size do you want?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great. What's the name?
Idris.
You can say it again.
Idris.
Great.
Thank you. I always thought the name came out of a book. My mother still has it. It's crude and it's orange and it says African names. Now inside African names, it says something like Idris means immortal, but I don't think that's right. My mother's name is Patricia. My father's name is Donald. Their parents are named Thelma, James, Ruth, and also James. They wanted us to have names with throat and vowels. In Detroit, the name was a minority. The black church asked, why you get that boy that Muslim name? Why you get that boy that African name? There are names in the good book, strong apostle names. There are names in the phone book, strong regular names. In the suburbs, the name was a minority. My middle American classmates asked, now is it Idris, is it Iris, is it Ivan, is it Isidore, is it Ivan, is it Iggy? How about I just call you I? Can I just call you E? Can I just call you something other than your name? Age 11, I asked my mom if I can change my name to something else. Mark, Tony, Sean, something else. Being named Idris in North America will arrest people. You must grow patience. That's so unusual. What an exotic name. It sounds Turkish, it sounds Greek. Are you Muslim? Age 16, 2 Arab dudes come through my register. They get big-eyed when they see my name tag. They're curious, how did the name make its way to a Target in suburban Michigan? They're disappointed when I tell them about the book, African Names. Some 10 years later, I'm in the Middle East where they pronounce it beautifully, not all straightened and flattened. They've given it a joyful bounce. Idris is a prophet in the Quran. Age 20, I'm new to Chicago. I'm cleaning cigarette butts out of a restaurant urinal for minimum wage. My boss is a giant stereotype of a man in a turtleneck, sport jacket, dark glasses, and a thick as Mike Ditka's mustache Chicago accent. He unzips at my urinal, the one I just cleaned, and then he says, I ain't gonna remember that name of yours. How about I just call you Eddie? And my name became Eddie. But then his assistant suggested he stop for fear I might claim cultural insensitivity. The gentleman from the UK tells me the Welsh have a myth. There's Morocco's Moulay Idris, the jazz world's Idris Muhammad, television's Idris Elba. How do you say it? That's so unusual. What does it mean? Prophetic cashier. What does it mean? Philosophic cleaner of urinals. How do you say it? That's so exotic. How do you say it? How do you say it? How do you say it? I call myself Idris, like my mama says it. She's probably not saying it right.
I was looking in the chat as you all were as the video was going, and I'm just going to lift some of the things that were put into the chat, and you all bring up some great points. Someone said, what if you don't have a name story? And someone said, what if this name story brings up something traumatic or a bad experience that a student may be going through? And those are things that building relationships with your students, you get to know better about what is going to be a great time to do something like this and what may not be. And for those that do not have a name story, one of the things that you can do is just ask them to share a special memory about their name. And it doesn't have to be the origin of their name, but it could simply be what a great story about someone calling your name, or someone that was an elder that called your name and brought a great memory to you, and so forth. And another thing that you can do is have the students look up the meaning of their name. There's so many things that students can develop from just thinking about their names and so forth. So I'm going to share my name story, and I'm going to read it. Towanda could have been a Tamara, but born after my first cousin. As fate would have it, I was destined for it. I was told by a professor that my name was derived from the South African culture, meaning of many. Our village is strong and the meaning is fitting. the youngest of 8 children, which includes 22 grandchildren. Let's not begin to count great-grand. I am who I am because of the bond and sacrifice of my ancestors before me and the God I serve. Peace, joy, and happiness has been instilled in my very being and is not based on the outside factors of racism, hate, and bias. Never ever found on a nameplate, souvenirs in the gift shop. I get a kick out of looking, yet reminded that my name is unique with a T-O-W and not a T-A-W, with one N, and don't forget the D. I have learned to embrace all that these letters encompass. Towanda of many. So think about this, what I just read about my name. What things really pop out to you if you had to think about what's important to me, if you had to think about what I value, what annoys me? Kind of drop in the chat, what are some of those things that you think about? Heritage, definitely. Family's important to me. The spelling of my name is important. The history, yes, definitely. I like that. The bond. And so you think about all of these connections that you have to me because I shared my name story. And so our students also have a story behind their name. And thinking about the curriculum to not teach it as something separate, but to look at it as a way to make connections to our students and what is important to them becomes very, very powerful in that. So now let's talk about our resources. So here's a study in 2015 from the Cooperative Children's Book Center. And the Cooperative Children's Book Center pretty much just looked at all of the children's books that were available and put them into categories of representation. And so in that, you see that the dominant books that were about, the dominant amount of books that were about a particular group would be white, 73%. And then it kind of goes down from there. And so for those who haven't seen the 2018, we are waiting for the 2021, but for those that have not seen the 2018, what do you think happened in 2018? Do you think that there was an increase? Do you think that it kind of stayed the same? Do you think that more groups were added? A decrease, not much. Okay, animals went up, not much. Okay, a slight increase. So let's look at what actually happened. All right. Well, if I look at the category of white, it went down, but where did it go? To the animals, yes, to the animals, but it did not trickle down to the rest of the groups. And so thinking about this being the inventory that curriculums are pulling from, we can't rely on curriculums to make sure that our curriculum is diverse or that our text choice or our learning experience are diverse. It takes an extra step for us to be very intentional about that. So now when you're thinking about those categories, there's also something called own voices books. So here's a little 10 to 15 second snip from my TikTok page. Yes, I'm on TikTok and I actually have a really good time on it, but I digress. On here, I kind of talk about what own voices books are and why they're so important. So let's talk about own voices books and why they're so important. Imagine if I were telling your story through my lens of seeing your life. Which one do you think will be more powerful, if I told it or if you told your own story? I would talk about what I thought your experiences were, how you felt about it. I could have read stories, maybe on your social media posts about what you were feeling, but it's more powerful if you did it, right? So think about own voices books, making sure that there is a connection between the author and the story that is being told. So here is an example of not being in own voices books. Who do you think's voices would be elevated in this story? Now, here's an example of an own voice book. Here you have a story of a young black little girl, a black girl, and then here. I'm laughing at the chat as I'm looking at it. Thank you all so much for encouraging me for my pastime on TikTok. Yes, it is a place. It's actually kind of fun. But again, we talked about the Own Voices books and why they're so important. So even though we're thinking about, bringing more diverse text to our classroom, we want to also make sure that there are Own Voices books as well. So I'm going to kind of ground our thoughts into the work of Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. And she talks a lot. She's known for so many things, but one of the things that I really like to pull out is her work around windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. Looking at text, looking at learning experiences as windows for us as a human being to look out at other perspectives, look at others' experiences. And then you have mirrors. Where do we see ourselves in the learning? And then sliding glass doors. Where do we see similarities? Where's empathy, born out of making sure that we see that we're not that different, that we do have some similarities. And so in this quote, pulling out that literature transforms human experiences and reflects it back to us. And in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as part of the larger human experience. Reading then becomes a means of self-affirmation. But when a child cannot find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images they see are distorted, they learn a powerful lesson about how they are devalued in the society of which they are a part. Dr. Sonia Cherry Paul did a wonderful, brilliant blog, and that is going to be dropped into the chat. And the title of the blog is We Need Books That Center Black Joy. And she talked about 4 different areas that we can think about when we're centering Black joy. But I want to say that this is not just for Black joy, it is for joy. It's for any other, when you're thinking of the chart, all of those that weren't represented, you want to make sure that you're being mindful of making sure that you have a variety of voices and perspective in the learning. So the first thing she talks about is thinking about characters, looking for books that present Black characters in a variety of ways so that students can imagine themselves in the past, the present, and in the future. What characters are there? Then you have family structures. What are those family structures? I know, I think about the books when I was in the classroom, the books that typically I would pick up, there was a mother and there was a father. And oftentimes there were children, mother, father, children. But think about family makeups and how they are so different. Some students have just a mother. Some students are raised by just their grandmother. Some students have 2 mothers. Some students have 2 fathers. Every family structure looks very different. So we want to make sure that the books that we are choosing are representative of just different lifestyles and perspectives. And then we have communities. When we're reading books, how do we see the communities being represented? Is it showing the richness of communities, the strength, the resilience of a community, or is it always in a negative light? And then lastly, racial and cultural identities. Looking for books where Black identities and cultures are represented powerfully and authentically. Making sure that we're selecting books that show authentic ways that Black people speak, where languages and traditions. And like I said, it's not just about Black, this can be carried over for any race and any culture. And all of this is centered in the joy. So going back to Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's work about making sure that there are windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors, that this joy connects the learning to our students. So here is this is a curriculum, the benchmark curriculum, and I just pulled up a page out of this curriculum, and this is a story that is being taught within this curriculum. And I'm going to pause and I want you to think about what you notice and what do you wonder looking at the pictures or if you can read this, I don't know if it's big enough, but if you can read it, what do you notice and what do you wonder? All the characters are the same race. Yes. No other culture is represented. Traditional European folktale. Who is relating to this text? Women are represented as a milkmaid. And those are things to think about. And then thinking about, what do you wonder? Now, I know that when I was in the classroom, or as I support schools, there are certain curriculums and there are certain resources that schools are asked to use. The way that I help teachers and the way that I help schools is to help them to make that connection. So if this is what we're going to use, how do we connect this resource to the learner? How are we going to do that? So here is a sample lesson that comes from that particular resource. And I'm just going to talk about the previewing the text and the modeling of the text as two entry points to make this connection. Because remember, at the end of the day, the learning in isolation is not going to make connections to our students so that they are able to feel seen, valued, and heard. So thinking about the characters, as you all have put into the chat, thinking about those characters, what characters are in here? Not to say that we just don't read this book, but we have to be mindful that we're acknowledging what characters are being represented here, so that when we do choose another book, that we can choose another variety or another perspective as well. Family structures. What are those family structures that are being represented? Communities, as well as racial and cultural identities. So in this resource, you see this question, and then the skill for this lesson was inference. And so this is the chart that was provided, and with making an inference, text, evidence, my own knowledge, and inference, right? When we're thinking about my own knowledge, my experiences may not be your experiences. I go back to my example about being afraid of dogs. If I read about a dog chasing someone or wagging their tail, you couldn't tell me that that dog wasn't going to try to eat someone else when I was younger. I had to do some relearning on the behaviors of dogs because of my personal experience with dogs. So my inference might be different than someone else's inference. And so being mindful of my own knowledge and understanding that we all bring different things to the table. And so here you have the question being, how do the illustrations, main characters, traits, motivations, and feelings described in the paragraph help to you to infer why Molly dreams of boys asking her to the dance and girls becoming jealous? That right there within itself is a question of what if I don't like boys? What if I don't like girls? How do I answer this question when I'm pulling in my personal experiences from there? So now let's try to find something common. Have you ever felt like someone didn't like you, that you weren't good enough to do something? How did that make you feel? So now we've all experienced that in some way, shape, or form. Making sure that our questions will add to what it is that we're putting in, what it is that the resource is using to make sure that, again, we are connecting it back to our students. So I'll close out on this section of why being equitable matters. A quote from Zarita Hammond. Some educators think having a multicultural classroom library makes them culturally responsive educators. Other educators have come to understand that multicultural education has its limits when it comes to instruction. Instead, they focus on social justice education. But the misunderstanding that some educators have is, if I simply discuss issues of oppression, read books about civil rights, their leaders, and people who work against oppression, then my students' cultural identities will be affirmed. And so as we talked about earlier, that is not the case. We have to make sure that it is not in isolation that we're connecting with our students, that we are pulling it into all of the learning. And so lastly, as we close out with the structures, where does this fit into our day? How is it a part of who we are and how we run our classrooms? We think about gradual release and that there are several entry points into gradual release. The modeling that happens, the sharing, the guiding, and going down to independent practice. And as you can see with the visual, that the teacher starts to minimize and then the student starts to get a lot larger. How are we welcoming or creating spaces in which students' voices become a part of the learning? We can't go to the next step if you don't share. And what you share is going to be a part of where we go next. Just because it's on the next page doesn't mean that that is the next direction that we're going in, and making sure that we are responsive in our teaching. So here's a quote from Dr. Gholdy Muhammad. When the world has not shined a light on you in the way that you deserve, you have to unlearn and rebuild and reclaim who you are. And that's what we want for our students. We want them to know who they are not, who they are destined to be. So Dr. Gholdy Muhammad has a framework, and I'm sure that a lot of you all are familiar with this framework, and her book, Cultivating Genius, will be in the chat as well. Now here's a story, a wonderful story, Milo Imagines the World. And it is a story about a little boy and his sister going on the train to go visit their mother who is incarcerated. And on the way there, he is imagining this world, looking at the different things that are happening as he's on the train, as they are interacting with other individuals, some assumptions or thoughts that he may have about the individuals, and some relearning that he will have as well. So it's a great book. And so when we think about the Dr. Gholdy Muhammad's framework, first and foremost, identities. How will your teaching help students to learn something about themselves? Skills, because we do want to, it is a teaching point. How are we using skills, or what skills and what content learning standards are you teaching? Intellect. Remember, our children are brilliant. They bring so much to the table. And when we think about this whole idea of learning loss, and yes, I'm going to get on my soapbox. Learning loss would mean that there was something that it's a deficit mindset. It's something that you don't have. And our students come to the table with so many things. They're brilliant. And so our job is to think about ways that we can build upon what they already know and how we can create an environment in which all students are learning from each other and that we are learning from our students. And then lastly, criticality. How will you engage your thinking about power, equity, and anti-oppression in the text, in society, and in the world? Going back to mirrors, sliding glass doors, and windows. How are we making sure that these things are possible day in and day out? And so as we close, I want you to think about some ways that we can make sure that we are equitable in our practice. We have the non-academic space. Think about this as an educator. In what ways do I connect with my students in this space? Academic. In what ways do I connect with my students in that space? And then also, in what ways do my connections influence my instructional planning and practice? I know that we have scope and sequences. I know that we have things that we have to teach our students, but we also have to make sure that we are very responsive in our instruction so that we can center our students in our decisions to help them to be better in the world. So I know that was a whole lot, but I want to leave time for some questions at the very end. But here are some ways that you can follow me if you want to learn a little bit more about some of the things that I talked about. I try to share strategies. I always try to share resources, free resources that educators could have access to. And here are all of my social media handles. I thank you all for the TikTok encouragement. There's my TikTok handle as well. And that is it. So I'm going to leave some time for some questions. I'm so excited to kind of dig into some of the questions and hopefully this time together. I know the chat was going so fast I couldn't even stop and read it, but hopefully you all were able to learn together. Ms. Patricia, you're on mute.
Dr. Towanda Harris, on behalf of ILA, thank you so much for being here tonight. We also would like to thank the sponsor of this webinar, Heinemann. Thank you. Thanks to those of you who submitted questions. We will try to get to as many of these as possible. Okay. Let me see. I see a few questions in the chat. The one question is, how could you possibly make some curriculum materials prepared for children in a wider context on national level of own voices, inclusive books?
So I just recently did a blog on some ways that you can do that. It was with Read and Recovery. It was on the Read and Recovery National Association. And I talked about just some things that you can think about when you have a curriculum that possibly just cannot be adjusted. We know that, schools are different, districts are different. And so we are very mindful of that as we're supporting schools. But one of the things that you can do is you can pair text. So if there is a particular story or a title that you are being asked to read within the curriculum, I want you to think about some similar titles that you can pull in that may have different characters and may have different family structures and so forth. And that might require, an extra step. But as you begin to look, you'll start to see more titles that are very helpful when you are trying to pair other texts as well. Another thing that you can do is you can swap out titles. You can swap out the titles and teach the same skill. And so really keeping in mind, moving away from the idea of I am going to teach about a particular culture or a particular race when we are celebrating them. For example, Black History Month, reading about Black characters or Black historical figures, but really pulling it in. If I am talking about, if I'm bringing in, things about anything in science or anything in social studies and so forth, I can pull in historical figures that are Black as well during that time and not waiting for a certain time of the year to celebrate them as well.
One person asked a very interesting question. How do you handle teacher backlash for trying to incorporate diverse materials?
That is a great question. And, unfortunately, that's kind of an obstacle that we all have to kind of get over. One of the things that I really try to speak to is the humanity of just individuals. And so thinking about our students and the different experiences that our students bring to the table. And well, let me give you an example and hopefully this helps. My daughter, she was in a school in which she was the only Black child, and she was the only Black child for 3 years in that particular school. And I remember she would come home and there were certain books and certain things that she talked about, and they were everything was about white characters, white stories, white experiences, and so forth. And so as a family of color, as a Black family, I asked the teacher, I said, is there any way that maybe we can pull in some more titles that maybe were more inclusive of different perspectives, different cultures, different races? And the teacher, and I offered to help, and the teacher said, well, this is what we'll do. What we'll do is when she goes to the media center, we can pull some books to the side so that she can begin to see books of characters that look like her. And so, of course, I take a deep breath in and I take a deep breath out. But I realized that what the teacher didn't understand is the need for representation. And so when I, kind of calmed down and went back to them and I said, okay, how can I help you? Because my daughter is being affected in the way that she's coming home and she's saying, okay, this is wrong in our family and this is right because of what she's reading, because of what she's experiencing and what discussions are happening. So it is a process. It is not something that happens overnight, but trying to start the conversation from the humanity aspect, making sure that, everyone understands that everyone wants to feel valued. Everyone wants voices want to be heard, and trying to slow walk it in that way might be a great start.
Well, one person asked a very interesting question. How do you know when a classroom is equitable?
Ha! I liken it to parenting. How do you know you're a good parent? Well, you just never do. As soon as we write the book for a good parent, then another child comes and then that's it. Well, when you're thinking about equitable practices, I want you to, kind of step back. One thing that you can look for is student agency. What is happening? And really think about who is doing the most talking in the classroom, who is leading more of the discussion, who is participating the most. The goal of being equitable is that you are creating opportunities for all students. I know that when I was in the classroom, I was guilty of always calling on the student that was so eager to answer. And you're thinking of trying to get through curriculum because we don't have a lot of time. We could always use more time as a teacher. And so when we're trying to get through the curriculum, sometimes we don't think about it, but we are calling on the same students over and over and over again. So when you're thinking about this, one practical thing that you can do is to think about ways that you're engaging your students. Who are you calling on most? How are your desks arranged? Who typically sits in the front? Who typically turns in their work and is, eager to share? And when you see, the students, if you see disparities among maybe all of your boys or all of your girls or whoever it is that you have, whatever gender preference they are, then you want to make sure that you are still providing, just kind of step back and say, well, how could I make sure I'm welcoming all voices into this space, all experiences into this space?
I'm going to give you one more question. How do you deal with educators who don't see these clear discrepancies with our colleagues? That's what the person wrote, who fail to see the best of our students with our global educational situations. That's what that person wrote.
That's a great question. And I think that is going to always be, it is always going to be a battle, and one of the things that I try to do is I work with, or I try to help to support those that are ready to kind of go on this journey. And sometimes we get so frustrated with those that aren't ready to move yet that we miss out on those that are ready to move. You have to get in the mindset of the train is moving, because at the end of the day, who is going to suffer? It will be our students. And so if that means that, I'm sorry, that's my timer.
Okay.
That means that if that means that we are only kind of starting with our classroom and making equitable choices with our classroom, making sure our text is diverse, making sure we're doing these things, and that we are inviting others to see that value in there, then that might be a good start. We are in an age of social media in which we can still connect with other educators that are doing this work. There are so many brilliant educators that are in the classroom that are doing this work. So look on Twitter, follow those that are doing this work. On Instagram, who's doing this work? Join Facebook groups, small groups, and you can create your own learning little circle. And I think about my squad. Who is my squad? Who is it that when I get frustrated or when I get tired or when it becomes overwhelming, that I go to so that I can kind of step back, reflect, where am I in this work? Where am I kind of putting my emotions or my bias on my sleeve, and then move forward from there. So hopefully that.
Another big thank you to Dr. Towanda Harris for sharing her time and expertise with us this evening. For those of you interested, her book, The Right Tools, is available to buy now from Heinemann. Use the coupon code CONF21 at online checkout for a special discount on this book when you purchase at Heinemann.com by April 30th, 2021. And thank you again to all of you for joining us and asking such great questions. I hope everyone leaves tonight inspired and ready to make equitable instructional decisions that position students at the center of learning. Remember that a closed caption recording of this webinar will be available within 10 days. We have a few upcoming events that I want to share with you. Join us on Thursday, April 22nd at 5 p.m. Eastern for our next ILA webinar, How to Accelerate Literacy Learning, Teaching Beyond the Pandemic. During this ILA webinar, Douglas Fisher and Nancy Frey will discuss some of their biggest priorities as educators make the transition back to face-to-face learning. Then on Tuesday, May 11th, at 5 p.m. Eastern, join us for our Children's Literature Intensive, Creating a Culturally Responsive Classroom Through Books. At this ILA Intensive, hosted by Dr. Tiffany Flowers, we will focus on incorporating culturally relevant and responsive children's literature in meaningful ways. This event features 25 authors, and participants will take away concrete ideas on how to do this important work instead of simply hearing about why it is important in the first place. Please keep an eye on the ILA digital events webpage, literacyworldwide.org/digital events for additional on-demand content and upcoming webinars and learning opportunities. If you are not already following ILA on social media, make sure to do so for the most up-to-date information. Good evening, and thank you for attending this webinar.